My name's Asia Lara, and I'm a program manager at Humanities Washington. We're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to open minds and bridge divides by creating spaces to explore different perspectives. We at Humanities Washington acknowledge that we present this program from the traditional and occupied lands of the Coast Salish peoples. We ask for those participating in this event, wherever they may be, to reflect on the lands that they inhabit and to acknowledge the ancestral and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. This event is part of the Humanities Washington's Rebuilding Democracy Initiative, a deep dive into the state of democracy, voting, and civic engagement that is presented in partnership with stations KUOW, KPBX, and Northwest Public Broadcasting. It's produced with the support of the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils, and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We thank them for their contributions. We also have several upcoming Speakers Bureau events, so please check out our calendar at humanities.org to register for talks on such topics as strong women in the early 20th century and lessons of the Japanese American exclusion. If you're interested in programs like these, please consider donating. Before we begin, please note that this is a recorded event. Tonight, our panelists will be taking questions following the discussion, so please submit your questions at any point through the Q&A box. Our goal at Humanities Washington is to create space where we can have important conversations like these in a civil manner. Harassment or otherwise inappropriate behavior will result in removal from the event. We are in different places with different circumstances and different beliefs, but even so, tonight we're together contemplating the same questions. Unfortunately, Cristina Ortega won't be able to join us tonight due to a personal conflict, but we're so excited to have Lady Debra and Senator Randall here as panelists. I'd like to now introduce our moderator for the night. Ramon Johnson is an interdisciplinary artist and Black queer feminist researcher. Their works include a co-directed short film titled Beyond the Battleground and a co-authored manuscript titled We Are Not Victims, Unmasking Black Queer and Trans HBCU Student Activism. They are currently completing their PhD in Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington. So without further ado, please take it away, Ramon.
All right. Hold on just a second. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Ramon Johnson. Thank you all for joining from all over. I hope that everyone's safe and sound. And let's get ready for a great discussion. Today's panel is being hosted by the Humanities Washington Pride and Power panel this evening on the history and future of queer and trans politics. And this event is part of Humanities of Washington's initiative for rebuilding democracy, which is a deep dive into the state of democracy, voting, and civic engagement. And it's presented in partnership with stations KUOW, KPBX, and Northwest Public Broadcasting, and produced with the support of the Mellon Foundation and the Federation of State Humanities Councils. It's a pleasure to be your moderator this evening. And today we're joined by some phenomenal leaders for a discussion about how queer and trans community has historically been involved in and excluded from politics, our current queer and trans political climate, and the work we have to do to manifest and create a new world where queer and trans folks can thrive and not just survive. So together, our panelists will examine our politics and fight for queer and trans liberation and justice as a means to framing out some solutions to queer and trans inequity in America. More on that in a second, but first, I want our panelists to take some time to introduce themselves, starting with Lady Anderson.
Hello, thank you so much for introducing me. Lady Anderson here. I prefer she and her. I'll accept all the pronouns used with respect. I'll just go over my bio very, very briefly. Short and simple, I'm committed to uplifting BIPOC, LGBT, queer, and trans communities by increasing access to health equity and self-determination. That's the short of it. I've been involved in advocacy in some form for about 14 years through legal, medical, youth, domestic violence, sexual assault, and larger queer policy advocacy throughout the country. Back on the East Coast, where I'm from, and I've been here in Seattle, Washington for about 8 years. Just as about 2 weeks ago, I was the Director of Policy Advocacy and Community Engagement at Gay City, Seattle's LGBTQ Center. I recently moved to my new position as the Program Director at Social Justice Fund Northwest. I will change that title soon to make it more jazzy because program director is a little drab for someone as fabulous as myself. I'm also a performance artist as the Lady B. So you can find my TED Talk, Voice and Vision, Healing the Scars of My Voice and Vision, Healing the Scars of My Political Body, is a piece I did from Middlebury College, where I graduated from undergrad many years ago. I think that's the gist of it. I love being great and amongst wonderful people, and I'm really honored to be here tonight.
Next, we have Senator Emily Randall.
Hi there. I'm Emily Randall. I represent in the Senate the 26th Legislative District. That's across the sound from Seattle on the Kitsap Peninsula, from Bremerton, where I live, to Port Orchard, Gig Harbor, and the Key Peninsula. And I have been in the Senate for this, I just finished my 3rd legislative session. I grew up in Kitsap County, in a union family, working class. I learned about activism when my sister Olivia was born with disabilities, and I started looking for ramps and complaining when people would park in front of them. I'm a first-generation college graduate. I graduated from Wellesley College in Massachusetts, where I went because they gave me the most money and I could afford it, and just feel so honored to have had the chance to learn amongst other rad, femme, and queer folks on a campus that was all about women's leadership. And then I worked at a number of places in health and education, fundraising and advocacy. I raised money for Wellesley, for Planned Parenthood, Federation of America, for the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, and then decided in 2016, like so many LGBTQ folks and women and young people, that I needed to get more involved in politics, and ran for Washington State Senate in 2018. And there I serve as the chair of the Higher Education and Workforce Development Committee, and as our Majority Caucus Whip.
Awesome. And last and certainly not least, we have Debra Salazar.
Thank you. It's good to be here or there. I'm Debra Salazar, and I teach political science at Western Washington University. I think the reason I'm on the panel is that I teach a course in queer and LGBT politics. Mostly I study environmental inequality. And other than those things, I think I don't do anything practical of any practical value. I tend to, hang out wherever I am, and with books and hopefully people to talk to about politics. I'm pretty much driven by my obsessions with democracy, justice, place, and family. And so I'm somewhat limited, or lots limited.
Awesome. Well, to get things started, I want us to just take a breath and really just think and reflect about the past year, but also all the years that have brought us to this point, for us to be having this important conversation. When we think about the year of 2021, 2021 was a heavy year. And it was, there have, I would say, been over 100 anti-trans legislations being proposed in state legislators across the country right now. And I would say this is the worst year of anti-trans discrimination ever in US history. And instead of responding to the greatest issues that are currently threatening the lives of different folks from different backgrounds, our some legislative leaders in power have chosen to use fear-mongering and anti-Black politics to create laws to further marginalize queer and trans folks across this nation. So when considering all of you all's backgrounds, I really just want to ask this first question about like this notion of queer and trans folks and representation within our political system. For many years, the government's simultaneous exploitation of queer and trans labor and depoliticizing tactics has allowed elected officials and the state to both tout marginalized groups to bolster diversity and inclusion and make the needs of queer trans folks ultimately invisible. Um, do you all believe that queer and trans representation is enough? I would like to hear some of your thoughts on this, starting with Lady.
Very well then. So there are lots of great questions in that question. I think the first one I want to speak to is more the context, like one as a survivor and someone who has supported survivors for many years of my life. I think it's important to remember that survivors are really good at surviving. And so the shenanigans may continue, they may persist, and we're very good at surviving. It doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that we don't deserve more, but I think it's important to, I think especially as a queer Black trans person who grew up in the inner city of Cleveland, Ohio, it's very easy to nowadays to think about, the sky is falling all the time, especially after surviving 2020, where it felt like every day the sky was falling in a new way. To remember that we're really good at making it work, and no matter what they try to do, no matter how they try to do it, we're gonna be here, and we're gonna support each other. So that's one question addressed, or one prompt addressed. And then what was the main point of the question you asked me again? What was it again? Oh, representation is enough. No, is the short answer. Obviously not, it's not enough, because I think when we get to representation nowadays, I think people are afraid of addressing identity politics. Like it's the boogie person in the closet, where it applies, my experience, even as I'll compare like my mother and I, right? I was raised by a Black cis woman in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm a Black trans woman from Cleveland, Ohio. We lived in the same house for a very long time, but we have very different experiences. We still need access to the same things, but in different ways. My engaging with medical access is very different than my mother engaging with medical access, And so the same way another trans woman who's transitioning in a way that's different than my own, even with just medical access, we're gonna need very different things, right? We're gonna have very different experiences. And so we're gonna be able to give voice to very different concerns in a different way. It's not to say that we have to have Captain Planets of all of our issues at once. And it's important to have our representatives be open to the experiences of people besides their own. But the idea that just having someone who fits some identities would solve all the problems is silly at best. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. What about you, Senator Emily Randall?
Everything that Lady said. I think no, representation isn't enough. It's important. It's important that we are in the rooms where decisions are made, that more and more and more of us are in those rooms, and just ensuring that someone is in the room doesn't mean that the power structures and the systems that we operate in are different or responsive. I talk about this a lot with my fellow members of the growing LGBTQ caucus and also of our members of color caucus in the Senate, that it matters that we're there and that we are bringing the voices of folks from our community. And there is an expectation sometimes in some systems of power that you as one person can speak for everyone who is in community like you, that I am a queer, cis, Chicana person from a semi-rural community, but I don't speak for every single other person that has those identities. And I certainly don't speak for everyone in the LGBTQ community or every Latina or, every person from rural Washington. So I think it's important. It's important that we keep diversifying our systems and the representatives in those spaces. And I think it requires a lot of inside organizing and outside organizing. You know, it's our systems of power are only change when there's a lot of pressure applied to them. They're old and slow moving, and there are 49 of us in the Senate, and we each get a vote, but we are so influenced, as we should be, by the voices of those in our communities who are asking and demanding and rallying for change. And that's what I love about representative democracy, because it's a team sport. And so, you know, I introduced some policies that are important to me as a LGBTQ person, as a woman of color, around health equity, around health discrimination. And I don't come up with those ideas in a vacuum. I hear from community members who need change. So it's important and it's not enough, I guess, is the answer.
Senator, I'm glad that you also touched on a few things that I want to tease out later on in our discussion, but one of them you mentioned gradualism and also democracy. And I really am interested in like your experience and how you've been navigating that and notions of what we understand to be a democracy, but also like knowing that these systems of power at play are very real. So I'm gonna give you a follow-up question for you, but also everyone else. But lastly, Debra, please, we'd love to hear from you as well.
On the representation question, well, I agree with everything people have said so far. I'll just add that there's a whole bunch of political science research on representation in elected office. And one of the things that one pattern that seems to have emerged in more recent studies is that women of color in elected bodies tend to behave differently than men of color and white elected officials. And there aren't enough trans and non-binary elected officials to say anything there, but women of color tend to be among the most progressive and provide the most representation for their communities. So that's, I'm always,
Before we shift, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I was going to say one other thing, but.
Oh yes, continue. Yeah.
Well, I just in your introduction, Ramon, about all of the anti-trans bills in state legislatures right now, I think we can almost see those as a sign of strength of these movements, because those bills are a reaction to changes that reactionary people see. And so you can go back to the early 1990s when there were anti-LGBT civil rights bills or civil rights initiatives on state ballots, several of them in the early 2000s, anti-marriage initiatives on state ballots and in state legislatures. And I have to put a little parentheses there, as you know, I don't see marriage as an end all or goal, or it holds little interest for me personally or politically, but still it matters to a lot of people. And you know, those initiatives and those bills and legislatures were just the preview to the realization of marriage equality. They just, so I think these anti-trans bills are a sign, actually, that we're going to see more change in how trans people are treated in society. And certainly, I'm going to actually say something complimentary about one of my least favorite candidates in the Democratic primary last year. President Biden's, one of his first executive orders was about LGBTQ equality, and it was sweeping in its scope. So, okay, I stopped there.
Thank you. So a lot of themes, yes. Yeah.
May I say one quick thing before we move on to this point?
Of course.
Quick. So Senator Randall mentioned something that I want to point to around representation and the importance of community health, the perspective I'm coming from, is I think there's a trap with representation where if you have a representative, people often think you don't have to ask community, which I think is always the trap. And so like, just because you have someone in power who has those identities doesn't mean, it actually means it's even more important that we ask directly the communities what it is they need and move forward with that. I think that's like a tricky slippery slope with politics engagement. People think you don't have to ask. Like, you always have to ask. The answer is you always have to ask the people what they want and you give them that. Okay, now stop. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. So just to add to that, some of the things that you all were talking about, like tokenizing, gradualism, and also this notion of queer and trans people being resilient. Like, we are resilient people, but also we know that just because we are resilient doesn't mean that we but this doesn't mean that we, deserve to, have to wait so long for change to happen. But it's causing me to think about like this term progress and what that necessarily means under dominant culture and in this society. And when we consider how queer and trans politics have been impacted, like by the 2016 elections and current events, I'm wondering, like, how might we enhance our political and organizing strategies? And how might this look in each of your respective fields and careers? Starting with Debra.
I'm not sure that I'm the best person to ask about how we will enhance our political organizing strategies. I'm mostly an observer of organizing strategies. So I'll admit to poor character there. But I would say that those strategies seem to have been, the existing strategies seem to have been, had some effect. And in our earlier meeting, I talked about the prominence of queer people in movements like Black Lives Matter, undocu-queers, those kinds of movements, and how queer and trans people have really shaped a broad swath of American politics, issues way beyond ourselves. And I think that matters for building coalitions in the future. So if I had to suggest how we move forward, I would say the same way we've been moving, at least those parts of the movement have been moving.
Thank you so much, Debra. And there's also nothing wrong with being someone who has their eyes and ears open. I think that's so important and necessary. What about you, Lady Anderson?
It's a great question. I agree with Debra, is the short answer. People know what's happening. I think the big movement, especially being in queer and trans community, I think it's very funny how I had a friend the other day who was a straight cis woman who was like asking about new people that I could connect her with, and I realized, like, oh, I don't know straight people. I'm just like, oh, I don't think I know it. Straight cis men. I'm like, oh no, I don't have any of those in my life. So I think I get kind of insulated, thankfully, in a very interesting weird way. But it's also given me the really great privilege to learn really what is queer community about, because it's just around me constantly. And to hear the kind of conversations that I get to have in queer and trans community here in Seattle are very different than conversations I had in Vermont or New York or Ohio. Just very different, And specifically, I think being a director and like having been in the movement and the anti-violence movement for so long, there's a very specific conversation about what does it mean to work in solidarity with each other? What does it mean to work in community with one another, which were the same conversations that were being had in the 1960s civil rights movement. So I think there's something about, I think that's where it lives. The same energy that we're working with there now lives in Black, queer, and trans community, and Black, queer, and trans youth specifically, as Debra was mentioning. So I think there's something really important around collectivist strategies, around taking care of each other as people. I think that's the most important part to really go forward. It's not all the big flashy initiatives. It's like, how do we show up for each other as individual people? How do we show up for ourselves? How do we navigate conflict? How do we deal with boundaries? Yes and no boundaries. How do we get the care that we need? How do we determine what care do we actually need? And how do we move towards it? That's really the work to be done now, if that makes sense.
Yes, most definitely. Senator Randall.
Yeah, I think it's so much has already been said about this, but intersectional solidarity is really where we continue to grow, our power. We've been reflecting on, this last legislative session, how we build our priorities as a Senate Democratic caucus, but also as the LGBTQ caucus and as the members of color caucus. And this year, for the most out of the last 3 years that I've been a part of this process, I've seen so much sort of cross-pollination among those caucus priorities. In our LGBTQ caucus, we really made police accountability and racial equity a priority in a way that we hadn't done really thoughtfully in previous years. And the same way in our broader Senate Democratic caucus, we saw equity as sort of an overarching bucket for all of our policy priorities. And in fact, for the first time, built a tool. It's really just like a handful of questions for our chairs to be using when they examine the policies that come to their committee and are thinking about ranking them. And the questions are, who is adversely impacted? Are there marginalized groups that experience the impact more than others? And have you consulted with them about, what the impacts are going to be? And, it seems like obviously we should always do that thing, but it doesn't exist. It hadn't existed in our process in this way before. And so I see that as the internal organizing, but also as an opening for external organizing, coming into the legislature. We got a chance to build stronger relationships with, LGBTQ, communities of color organizations, representative organizations. And I'm really excited for that to continue happening, for more groups to come and say, these are our priorities and how they impact our community, and to have more of an open door and more listening ears in the caucus. Because it really does feel like a changing time to be in politics. And it's not new, like the pain and suffering that our communities are facing is not new, but I think the willingness to understand and learn and, work side by side to be responsive is different. It feels different, even across only 3 years of experience. I feel like this is a moment where there's a lot of opportunity for growth and change. And it's reflected in the budget if anyone wants to read a small forest worth of pages of operating budget. Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Randall. And before we move forward, for those of you who may be wondering in the audience, there was a term that was mentioned, intersectionality. If you all do not know, intersectionality was actually coined by Black feminist scholar Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw back in 1989. And even though the theory formed into language, then Black feminists before her were already doing the work of intersectionality in practice as well. But it's a framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create modes of discrimination and privilege. And some of these examples include gender, class, race, sexuality, religion. But I bring that up because it's just shows how important, that we get clear on what we value in moving forward in our politics. And I noticed that some of you all also mentioned the collectivist strategies that are very important, as well as navigating conflict. And I think that in order for us to have a collectivist strategy and navigate conflict efficiently, folks in power and with privilege have to have that motivation to actually do the work of interrogating the violence within them. So, Lady Randerson, I remember you actually mentioning about like how it can be difficult for trans folks to be in community with cis heterosexual people, simply just because, I don't know, they may or may not see us as human, or whatever reason. That's not our labor or burden to bear. But it just goes to show that um, we have to, as for people in the audience who may not identify as being queer or trans or cisgender, that you have to, not only just come to these forums and listen, but you have to put, what you're learning into action. And yeah, queer and trans people shouldn't have to be the only people, doing this work, you know. So thank you all for all of your thoughts and contributions. And with that said, moving forward, I wanted to ask, what role has feminist and queer and trans participation played in the development of American politics, in you all's opinion? And just how does queer and trans participation continue to shape our political landscape and social change? We can start with you, Lady Anderson.
My internet decided to have a disco party, so you went away and then were very fast all at once. I was like, that's fine, I guess. I think what you asked me was.
You can repeat it.
Thank you.
Yeah, what role do you think that feminists and queer and trans participation have played in the development of American politics? And how does queer and trans participation continue to shape our political landscape and social change?
Yeah, so I know both Debra and Senator Randall have already spoken about it already. And you just spoken about with intersectionality, one of my favorite terms. And I know you know this, and you've been kind to people, and you didn't want to go all the way there, but I'm going to go all the way there. That Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term specifically to talk about the violence that Black women experience. And I think that when we talk about intersectionality as a general free-for-all, everyone's coming to the cookout with an empty plate and nothing else, and not realizing like, hey, wait a minute, we're talking about a specific group of people here, because Black women, queer and trans, cis women, Black women are always left out. We're always left out, and to Deborah's point, we're always showing up to save the day.
Mm-hmm.
Always. And like, why is that? It's almost as though we have like the depending on how you look at it, but the least institutional power, which means we have the most burden, which means that if we're actually supported, and we know if we're actually supported, everyone else benefits.
Yes.
Like if we're in the room, you're all welcome. It's just like, the answer is yes, whenever we're in the room, because we're gonna make it happen. We bring abundance. And that's just me speaking as like a person, and just a person, where like you all are welcome for my presence, is how I feel about every room I show up in. And also just knowing from being amongst other Black women. Like, so we give it to you at every ball. It's just, that's the simple answer. Does that meet the needs of your question?
More than met.
Great, lovely.
Thank you. What about you, Debra?
I'm not sure that I can say it any better or differently. But that is why that women of color elected representatives are on the forefront and really change what legislative bodies do.
You know what? Also, before I say this, Senator Randall, did you want to also contribute?
Well, I just wanted to take the opportunity to shout out two women legislators, Senator Rosa Franklin, who was the first Black woman elected to the Washington State Senate and really was a catalyst for change. Also, a healthcare provider, she's a nurse and a nurse educator, and was a woman whose legacy, she's not dead, she's still alive, but her legacy is still felt powerfully in the chambers of the Senate. And Twana Nobles, who was just joined us for her first legislative session this year, the only Black woman in the Washington State Senate, the only Black senator in Washington at the moment, who also has a really powerful impact on our community, and who is not enough. So I guess I would say the way that we continue to have an impact is by continuing to stand on the shoulders of the women, particularly LGBTQ Black women, but also of the women of color who show up in the communities, to stand on their shoulders, but also to lift up those among us who are leading the way currently and presently. So
Thank you so much for uplifting those women, especially Rosa Franklin. I actually didn't know about Rosa Franklin until I actually got accepted into University of Washington. And just this is amazing, actually, just to think about her career trajectory, and how she even started as a registered nurse before even becoming an elected representative. But it's just speaking to your point, it's also so important for us to remember those giants, who came before us, to pave the way for what we're doing right now. And for our next question, right now, I just wanted to think about like, what role does on the ground organizing work of queer and trans community organizing and activism play in affecting social and political change? And how can organizing work be more accessible for folks, who may not be able to, necessarily go to a protest, any one of you all can start. Mhm.
well, I'll start with some lessons I learned this year. This legislative session is one that, like, we have never seen before. For the first time, we're able to vote remotely. And we also saw a huge increase in the participation in committees. Folks were able to join and testify remotely from their car in the parking lot of their kids' school where they were dropping them off, from their lunch break room. We got calls from folks who were walking to catch the bus on their way to work. We saw people in their bedrooms with their cats in the background. And there was some concern at the beginning of session, and concerns that were repeated over and over by the party less supportive of LGBTQ issues, that there wasn't transparency and participation. But in fact, we saw the opposite. Yes, there was a fence around the Capitol and people were not allowed into the building, but we heard from more voices, more diverse voices than we have ever heard before. And my committee, Higher Education, has always, since I've been in the legislature, allowed remote testimony, but I'm so excited to build on the momentum we saw this year and to continue to allow for that. I'm also excited to be in community with people in person, but for folks with disabilities, for caregivers of loved ones with disabilities, for folks who are working multiple jobs, who can't get away from school, who can't drive over the mountains, who would need to take 4 buses in order to get to the Capitol, the participating remotely is power. And so that door continues to be open, and I'm excited for folks to use their voices in the political process. And also, I'm excited to continue seeking out folks who still don't know how to sign up to testify, who still don't know how to contact their legislators, because meeting people where they are is how we continue to build more power on the ground in community. So that's motivating me in these 2 days after session to keep the momentum going.
All right. What about you, Lady Anderson?
So many questions in there. I think, where will I start? I think one around accessibility, I'll start there. It's like, it just depends on who you're asking around accessibility. So that's just one step of that. I think Senator Randall spoke specifically to around like it's their job to meet people where they are. That's a second way to address that. Like you go do it. You you ask the questions of how they figure that out. But I think it's also important to ask the question about what is organizing. I, as a Black queer trans woman who's lived a rough life, you will not find me at a protest. It's not going to happen. Like my public health Black queer trans body is like protected. It's guarded. Especially over the summer, I live in Capitol Hill, very close to where a lot of the action was happening. And I told many of my friends, if you need me to extract you, sure, I will come grab you and drag you back into the building or take you somewhere safely. But what I focus on is Olivia Poping. It's my favorite thing. Just, making the phone call, Olivia Pope, you don't know that reference, Olivia Pope? No, okay. It's a Scandal, Shonda Rhimes reference where basically I do lots of things behind the scenes. I will make the phone calls, I'll make the reports for the city of Seattle, which changes policy and where they move millions of dollars, for years to come. I'll make sure the community has a text thread so they know how to support each other and look out for each other. Like that's all organizing. That all counts. Showing up for your people, that's work. It still needs to be done. I would even say it's more important because I think with organizing, there's the two frames of reference I think people go to. There's the burn it down and there's the build it up. And I think they're both important. Don't get me wrong, I can burn a bitch down if I need to, like the best of them. However, I think it's a very important skill to know, what are you building towards? Do we know what we need? Can we communicate that to one another? Right? How do we help build that with one another once we know what it is? That's all organizing. So it's not always about putting your body physically out there. I have not been physically close to another human besides my partner in nearly a year. I think one of my friends surprise hugged me when I saw them on the street. But besides that, I have not been physically near another person. I'm organizing my ass off, in ways that I couldn't have imagined. Even at Gay City, I helped move something like $700,000 in 1 year to like go back to communities, right? So it's just like, in a way where I wouldn't have been able to do that, I think, before. But it took being really clear and poignant, like my people are dying and more of them will die if I don't do something differently. And so it meant like being really clear and honest about what's happening and connecting with other leaders in a way that I usually wouldn't have had the time to do because they're so busy running around. So all to say, I think organizing looks like lots of different things, and just to push against the idea that organizing is just about protesting, because the only way you're going to find me out in the streets protesting is if I know, like, this is it. This is like the Avengers Assemble moment where we all, only then will you see me out in the streets.
What about you, Deborah?
I think I'll pass on this one. I think it's been answered. The questions have been answered very well.
Awesome. And the reason why I asked that question is because we've seen throughout the country how different, leaders and governors have passed laws or in bills that add obstacles to voting, including reducing the number of ballot boxes, especially here in Georgia, shrinking the window for early voting and adding additional photo ID requirements, and allowing state officials to even circumvent the work of county election officials if they don't like the outcomes they are seeing. I'm naming this because even though we can see, that folks are participating in our quote unquote democracy, there are still horrible and violent forms of voter suppression, happening, across, this country, and not just in Seattle, Washington. So I'm also wondering, and I really want to hear it from also Senator Emily Randall as well. Has it ever crossed your mind about like if a democracy or even a government will be in existence in the future
Wow. I don't know that I have had a second to even think about whether or not or there is an end to democracy or government. I need to spend some time contemplating that thought. I don't know if I'm terrified or like thrilled or what, but to the point of you know, the disenfranchisement of folks and the work happening around the country to minimize the participation in our democracy. It's one of the reasons I'm so honored and excited to be of service in Washington. You know, while states were removing ballot boxes and working to disenfranchise voters, we it's built on you know, the expansion of democracy that had already happened over the last few years and have now enfranchised an even greater number of folks by returning the right to vote to folks as soon as they leave prison walls in Washington state.
Mm.
So many more Washingtonians will be able to participate in our democracy, and we know it works better when more people participate. You know, while states like Idaho and so many others try to put barriers in place for trans people to participate in athletics or to get access to healthcare. Washington is ensuring that healthcare is more accessible to folks when they need it, that gender affirming care is more accessible. It's been a real honor, and I know that I'm lucky that I came in when the Senate had the majority, and we you know, have Democrats in power in Washington state, and I continue to knock on wood to hope that people feel well represented by a state legislature that is about removing barriers for everyone, even if you didn't vote for us, right? It's about ensuring that folks feel well represented. I don't know what the future of government looks like. I think Debra, as a historian, may have so much more to say on this issue, but you know, I'm about making sure that we take incremental or giant leaps forward every day to bring more people into participation, whether that's through voting or whether that's living their fullest lives without fear. And that's what excites me about the way that our government works for us here in this state.
Okay. Deborah and Lady, if you all wanted to add anything.
Well, I'll jump in. Just I think it's really important to imagine what societies might be like without government. My own tendencies are toward anarchism. At the same time, given that we live with so many people in across the globe and in small spaces, and given that capital is organized very well and has so much power and wealth, I guess I'm not prepared to dispense with even the very, very imperfect liberal democracy that we have. But I think it's important to imagine. Oh, go ahead, ask.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm glad that you brought up anarchism, which is going to lead into our second to last question. This question of anarchism and abolition, I think is something that we really need to get at. But before we get there, Lady Anderson, did you also want to add something?
Debra, do you have anything else you want to share before we go to me? No? Okay, we're going to do it. Okay, so a few things. My internet's doing the disco thing again, so we're going to just go for it. One, I really firmly believe that democracy is a trap and a lie. That's just how I feel about it. That I think it was Aisha Moody Mills, who I met, was a wonderful strategist. I don't know what she's doing nowadays, but Black lesbian woman who I met when I was in DC many years ago, working with GLSEN, the Gay Lesbians for Education Network. And she, I think it's credit to Ben Franklin. There's a quote of like, democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting for what's for dinner. You know, have you heard that quote before? That's what it is. So like, as a Black queer trans woman from Cleveland, Ohio, like most people don't even think I exist. They don't even know that I'm an actual person, let alone what my needs are. Like, you think these people are going to vote on my behalf? Like, they're going to know what's important for me, the basic parts of what it means for me to be a person, and will vote on my behalf? Like, no, that's not happening. That's not happening anytime soon. And I think the idea that that will happen is foolish. And it's, again, a trap and a lie, and I won't believe it. Even the way that, I know Debra can speak to this much better than I can, the like underpinnings of the way that this democracy, the democracy, representational democracy that we currently live in, is like based on the fact that people would be educated, right? And well versed in what are the needs of other people, while also I wouldn't have been a human. I wouldn't have been a full person just being Black. So like, there's so many like traps in the way that this democracy is set up. That said, I do not believe in like subjugate and dash. Like, this government isn't going to get away with having taken away resources from my people for centuries and just get to collapse. So like, we can have anarchy the moment the bill is paid. Because if you're not talking about reparations, I'm not even going to go all the way there, but just how much labor was taken from my people that hasn't been compensated for yet. Not the pain and the anguish, just how much labor was taken from my people. Compensate my people for the labor that they provided. Was taken from them was provided. And then only then will I allow a governmental collapse to happen. To be very, very, very honest.
Thank you, thank you. Debra, did you want to say something?
The government's going to last a long time. Yeah.
Especially when you consider how long anti-Blackness and colonialism has been intact. Yeah. Did you want to expound on that as well?
Well, this compensation for labor that was uncompensated, that would be justice, and that's what we ought to strive for and demand. And we might make some steps in that direction, get some small amount of compensation, and we push and tug to get that. But I don't expect it to be fully compensated.
Yeah, and for those of you all who don't know, the U.S. Congress took a step on April 14th of this year when congressional committee voted on a slavery reparations bill as well. Human Rights Watch actually said that the House Judiciary Committee announced an upcoming vote on HR 40 and the commission to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans Act. And I'll just to echo what has been said already, we've seen over the history of this nation, like how gradualism has been used, as a depoliticizing tactic to keep liberation from actually being actualized. And I'm actually thinking about Dr. Brittany Cooper, who talked about gradualism and time being very white, and how time has been used to, make the process of laws and equity very hard to obtain. And so moving forward, before we go into Q&A, for this last question, I want each of the three of you to talk about briefly, what do you all think is needed to actually abolish these different systems that are currently working? And it doesn't have to be anything fancy or long and drawn out. I ask this question because it's much needed, and I know we have a lot of youth in the audience right now. So I know you all are also wondering this as well. So.
I can start and I can go very quickly. It's the same point I mentioned before. It's not the organizing TM, but the organizing TM being trademark, but the organizing and what do we need? How do we show up for one another? How do we practice accountability in ourselves and with other people? How do we lift up the self-determination of other people and really hold that in a community level? And we can't have any type of abolition, or we can't have any revolution or liberation without a collective liberation.
Debra?
You mentioned young people in the audience, and I don't want to say anything to discourage them, so I'm not going to talk about gradualism, but I want to get back to democracy and ladies' perspective on democracy. I mentioned at the beginning that I'm obsessed. That's one of my obsessions, democracy, in the sense of popular sovereignty, or the people get to rule ourselves. And, you know, I say this as someone who could, you know, look out at the country and acknowledge that probably 30% of the people who I used to think of as my fellow citizens might be enemies, you know, might not have the slightest hesitation in causing me harm. But you know, we live together, and I can't think of well, I can't imagine a way that I would prefer to govern ourselves than to allow us to govern ourselves rather than to appoint someone. And that's what democracy is. And there are different forms of it for sure. And I think what we need to aspire to are forms that move us toward justice, towards fairness for all members of that community. It's not easy. We don't get there fast, but I think we have to do that. And I don't want to live in a place that's not democratic, small d.
So in my office in Olympia, I have a poster from the 2018 Women's March. It's like hot pink and wrapped in packing tape. And the quote on the side that's on the wall, facing out from the wall, is a Bell Hooks quote about the practice of love is the most powerful antidote to the politics of domination. And that's, you know, it's in my office because it's one that I like to keep reminding myself. I don't mean it in the way that you need to turn the other cheek all the time and that you need to accept, you know, what the politics of power throws at us, but that we have to take care of each other. And I do that in the laws I pass and in the budget I vote on. It's about investing in the tools that people need to take care of themselves and their loved ones, about the Working Families Tax Credit and TANF and healthcare access. And that's, you know, what the future looks like for me. That's how we protect the small d democracy, how we continue to engage the young people in the process, because, you know, we listen to each other and love each other in the work that we do. And it's easy to get daunted, I think, by the slowness and the gradualism and for me, the giant marble walls that were not meant for people like me and my community to walk in them. But bringing in the voices of young people in my community, young queer activists, you know, the fact that folks were able to testify this year for prison, that's how we break down those walls and love each other more actively.
Thank you all for your offerings. And right now we're going to transition into our Q&A portion. We want to hear from all of you if you have questions. So Asia, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Ramon. Really, really incredible questions. And thank you everyone here for participating. Let's see, we have a few questions coming in. And again, a reminder to attendees to please submit any questions you may have in the Q&A box. Right now, let's see, first question. What are the highest priority changes that need to happen in the context of politics and the LGBTQ plus community right now? What strategies do you advise?
I can go quickly. So the same answer I gave before is like the organizing starts at home. The racial equity starts at home. Like the revolution, the collective liberation starts at home. So it's like, are you yourself? I talk about this all the time with my partner who's a law student right now. It's like, is the mindfulness inside of you to do the work of liberation just inside of you as a person? Like in how you're holding yourself or how you're caring for yourself or how you're addressing your own needs. And then how does that ripple out to the other like levels and spheres, to your communities, to your partners, to your family? Yeah, that's the shorter answer. But I think government, no offense to you, Senator Randall, is a harm reduction strategy. I think it's important to engage in it as well. But the real work, I think, is really like, what are you doing? And don't look outside, don't look at over there. What are you doing for the collective liberation? And then how are you bringing in other people with that care and support?
Thank you, Lady Anderson. What about you, Deborah?
I'll pass on that one.
Senator Randall.
Lady is so on about that like self-care. That I had another in my talking points. My team reminded me of another quote, the Audre Lorde quote about caring for yourself is not self-indulgence, but an act of political warfare, and it's so true. And so on my side, I'm thinking about the politics in the legislature, engaging people in the work for particularly basic needs. We need more housing that's affordable. We need to ensure that folks can live safely and peacefully. And those are not like capital LGBTQ issues, right? They're not capital queer and trans issues, but they're all, like they are human issues. And our communities are often least from resources, farthest from resources. And so ensuring that the folks have access to affordability and are able to feed themselves and care for their families, that's that radical self-love and community love.
If I may add, also, in the past year, we've seen how mutual aid has really helped a lot of marginalized groups get through this horrible pandemic. I think that when it comes to empowering marginalized groups, a lot of folks with power and capital are quick to like donate their funds and their capital to a 501c3 or a nonprofit. But in reality, what we've seen through this mutual aid effort is that this money needs to be going to the people. And so I would just say that this politic of, giving resources directly to people has to continue, not just in crisis, but as an everyday practice. And it also has to, not be surveilled. So often, I actually, there are times where I know some folks experience getting their GoFundMes and their Cash Apps being shut down because I guess the state, wanted to assume that these folks were engaging in some type of illegal activity, and which is ridiculous. So I think that's one of the things that anti-Blackness and capitalism tries to teach us is that, just because I'm getting something or getting some type of resources doesn't mean I'm not stealing or eating off your plate. It creates this myth of, or this notion of scarcity. And I think that we have to push against that in order to move forward.
Thank you, everyone. All right, next question we have is LGBTQ too broad to encompass all of the political realities and interests of the groups that make up LGBTQ? Are there dangers of it fragmenting? And maybe we could go in reverse order. Ramon, if you wanted to contribute your thoughts.
Could you repeat that question again?
Of course. Is LGBTQ too broad to encompass all of the political realities and interests of the groups that make up LGBTQ? Are there dangers of it fragmenting? Or anyone else who has thoughts, please feel free to jump in.
I'd be happy to. I think that the breadth and fragmentation don't come with necessarily with identity. So across the letters of the alphabet, I think that the divisions are more likely about political agendas. And there's probably one dominant agenda that's about access to the benefits of liberal democracy and liberal capitalism. And then there's another agenda that's about undermining a lot of the institutions in society and the norms and settler colonialism and all of that. And that's not a division between L's and T's and G's and B's. It's a division among those groups that crosses identity categories. A radical part of the movement and a more conventionally liberal part. That's
I'll just add that this comes up a lot in discussion of the phrase BIPOC, that it's important for us to have a collective identity for solidarity. And when you are speaking about an issue that is only impacting Black women or only impacting trans individuals, then we should be specific, because that's not a universal queer experience. That is something that our trans siblings experience directly. And so I think it's important for us to have that LGBTQ or queer community, as we call it, and to all unite under the rainbow flag, and for us all, particularly cis queer people, to be thoughtful about the experience of our siblings and neighbors who are experiencing different and harms and different marginalization.
There's a quick thing I want to add. It's one of the things I assume, and thank you for reminding me that I make this assumption, that queer and trans people, not as a monolith, but in general, I think are more skilled or more regularly have to navigate nuance and holding complex nuances simultaneously. And I forget the non-queers and transes. And some, it's different. It's different. I'll just say, I'm not going to make any judgments about anybody, but the level of nuance we have to hold simultaneously is different. And we do it so often, where even something as small as, pronouns can change from day to day for some people. My name is legally Lady Anderson. That's confusing for some people, but I know people who use, what's that new one that people do, the neo pronouns or whatnot. There's a wide range of our people of experiences. And so I think we're a little bit more practiced as what it means to hold that together. And I think that is a gift that we can often provide to the people who maybe don't identify as the queer community. Like, step it up a little bit, practice. You can do it. I believe in you.
All right, let's see our next question. And I think that this one's going back to the question about community organizing. In practice, what does it mean to authentically and thoroughly ask the community what they need? Feel free to jump in whenever.
Repeat the question again, please, Aisha.
Yeah, of course. In practice, what does it mean to authentically and thoroughly ask the community what they need? And I think that this was in relation to the question about community organizing and hearing from the people.
So I guess from my experience in the legislature, in the past, inviting participation has sort of looked like expecting people to find where the bill is on the website, to know how to sign up and to know how to share their thoughts. And even as a member of the legislature, it's sometimes hard for me to navigate that website. So I don't expect all of our neighbors to know how to seek that out and find that information and know how to use their voices. So for me, I try to be as accessible as possible. We host like weekly coffee hours, either in person, pre-pandemic, or now we do them on Facebook Live. And I also, try to continually build a list of LGBTQ organizations and to ask folks I see in line at the grocery store who I learned through casual conversation are members of our community, what they care about and who they think I should meet. And that's just a practice. I think it's a practice of organizing. I don't know if this kind has a TM or not, but of building community in every possible way. And so, I mean, that feels like my responsibility as a legislator and a queer person. And I'm also seeing some of my colleagues who are not in our community trying to practice similar work. And I also think like inviting folks, organizations that know how to navigate that space, to bring their communities into the process too. But I think it's a lot of things happening all at once is what participation and organizing looks like.
I would also like to add that Google is a very useful tool. In addition to asking folks, what it may look like, or like how can you show up for them? I think that it's good to educate yourself as well about, the different issues that the queer and trans community is currently, battling. And I think that different mundane things to do, can look like supporting mutual aid efforts or educating yourself, like I said, about different issues, or reaching out to your legislative officials and speaking out against anti-trans or anti-queer legislation. It also can look like intervening when violence is happening in front of you. And that it takes, constant practice. But yeah, I can go on and on, but I'm gonna end right there. Also, I have to say this. The current reality that we are experiencing right now is one that is very violent. And I'm thinking about cultural critic and organizer Hunter Shackelford. They recently published an essay where they talk about, well, they basically state that we should never limit our realities, our embodiments, our imaginations, and our relationships, or our possibilities to the cages of anti-Blackness. Some of us, preach and end violence without the context that ending violence will require violence. So for those of you all who are cisgender or heterosexual, I would encourage you all to understand what the stakes are when it comes to ending violence against queer and trans people. It requires you to really stand up and be bold and be ready to go to war. And that's just me being very honest. I'm trying to put it as nicely as possible. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do I have a quick moment to answer her quickly as well?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I think it comes back, it's like my political science, public health streamlined situation. You have to have communities designing the programs. Yeah, that's just from the get-go, from the start. Communities have to be a part of designing the program and also evaluating it. And to Senator Randall's point, she already answered the question, but I want to just make sure to zoom in on that point. Like, what does it mean to have a community be a part of the process at every step of the way, and to really make it as accessible as possible?
All right, I have to jump off to be at another engagement, but I just wanted to say thank you all for sharing this community space with me, and for everyone watching and engaging. And I am accessible at emily.randall@leg.wa.gov. So share that and look forward to the next opportunity that we can build community together.
Thank you so much, Senator. We really appreciate you showing up. All right, at this point, we are out of time. And yeah, I just wanted to extend a huge thank you to Ramon, especially for facilitating, crafting these questions and just guiding us through. And to Lady and Debra as well, incredible contributions. So happy that you could make it here. And yeah, can't wait for future opportunities to work together. All right.
Thank you.
So from all of us at Humanities Washington, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you at our next panel discussion. All right, bye everyone.
Good night.